Today, we have a great speaker on a fantastic topic, and I am very happy to be able to introduce him. Today, we have Matt Sundquist, and I'll tell you a little bit about him. Matt studied philosophy at Harvard and wrote his senior thesis about Tupac and social contract theory. He then worked for SCOTUSblog.com before going on to Argentina as a Fulbright scholar. He's published papers on the Supreme Court, privacy, sundials, education, and foreign policy. He's been quoted in Senate Judiciary Committee testimony, the Stanford Law Review, the New York Times, National Law Review, and Yale Law Journal. He's currently the privacy program manager at Facebook, a member of the California Vital Statistics Advisory Committee, and a student fellow of the Harvard Law School program in the legal profession. So without further ado, I present Matt.
Hello, everyone. As was just noted, my name is Matt. I'll probably sit, if I can see. I would rather do this conversationally. I've taken some brief notes, which I may refer to as we're talking. But if you have questions as we're going along, please feel to break in, interrupt me, et cetera, et cetera. So first, would love to thank Bruce and the folks here for bringing me in. Bruce and I have a 3-year standing email relationship that we finally culminated with a handshake today. And I'm grateful for him for advising me on a variety of my sort of circular or eccentric research questions, which he's always been helpful with. So today I'm going to talk a little about privacy as it relates to, I think, kind of what's happening in society. So I'm going to structure this basically. I'll start off and talk about a way that I think we should prioritize threats to our privacy and threats to societal privacy, and kind of talk about a framework that I think we should rely on or come to rely on when assessing privacy risks or concerns. Then I'm going to talk a little about what I think the value of privacy is inherently to us as people. And then I will talk about some of the ways that it's complicated or difficult to assess privacy and why privacy is difficult to value from sort of economic and rational choice theory. And then I'll just apply basically some of the things I've talked about to some of the current problems that we have in legislation and the Supreme Court and elsewhere, and then talk a little about some of my concerns about FTC and other regulatory bodies. If you have any questions, please feel free to break in at any point. I welcome feedback, advice, other things of that nature. So the first thing I would say is, in a country of, as of the last census, 310 million people, I think it's always going to be inevitable that there will be violations of our privacy, that there will be, we have over 1 million people now who have top secret security clearance in the country. There's millions of law enforcement agents, and there will inevitably be abuses of our privacy. And that's kind of like a threshold matter that I think we need to understand before we think about privacy. But within that context, though, there are so many different privacy perspectives and frameworks that always get released, and different new laws that are coming out. There's the Fair Information Practice Principles. The White House came out with a privacy consumer rights paper recently. The FTC came out with a new report. There's always tons of new frameworks and commission reports and legislation coming out. And what I think is really complicating is a lot of these try and take 50 to 100-page long stances on privacy and apply it to the technology of the moment. But because technology is advancing so fast, and things that are possible now, things are possible now that were not even close to being possible like 5 years ago. Because we have basically what amounts to superpowers now, if you think about it. Like, my Gmail inbox is basically the equivalent of a superpower of memory. Like, I can store infinite amounts of memory there. We have infinite computing capacity now that we can easily get through the cloud. And so all of these things raise all of these new concerns that never existed before now. So I suggest that rather than trying to get really complicated and go on sort of a like case-by-case basis and assessing every new technology from like all these broad frameworks, the easiest way to do it is to just look at it from a very simplistic framework. And so for that, I have 3 suggestions for ways that we should value and assess privacy risks and concerns. The first is if something happens that breaks the law, plain and simple. Like, that should be something that we are concerned about. And it's kind of just like a black letter law question. We need to enforce the law. In a country of laws, one of the first things that we should assume is that the law gets enforced. The second thing that I think we should be concerned about is when laws are broken and they go unenforced, because I think that speaks to the first, and also both of these speak to, I think, the nature of the social contract as a really powerful part of American history. It is, having lived in a couple other countries, and I'm sure some of you experienced this if you've traveled, the way that the law is like an important cultural element in the United States is, I think, pretty unique in terms of like how much we value laws as solutions to problems here. And I think that in order to maintain that, and also because we've come to rely so much on the social contract and sort of the give and take of we make sacrifices, we give up certain things in order to get back protective measures from the government, it's really important that we maintain the law as a thing that we rely on to both regulate our privacy and also, if people break it, to bring people back into line. So unenforced laws, I think, should be really concerning to us as well. The third one is, and I think this is a little more touchy-feely, but if something happens that violates our social expectations, and so I work on products at Facebook, and one thing that we talk about is the idea of that we shouldn't surprise users. Like, people shouldn't be surprised by the way that their information gets used. And there's this awesome professor named Helen Niesenbaum who writes about this and talks about expectations. That you don't mind if you see your information used in some way if you expected it to happen that way. But if you didn't expect it to happen, or you were led to believe that your information was going to be used one way and it was used in another way, then that is disconcerting, it makes you uncomfortable, it makes you uncertain how to share things in the future, and it makes you like unreliant and non-trustworthy of the technology that compromised you or the company that compromised you. And so I think we should also think about ways that we can regulate and enforce our social expectations onto the world around us. And there's also a good amount of precedent, I think, at least from the Supreme Court's jurisprudence, of ways that we can do that. So those are kind of like the three general criterion that I think are pretty important for thinking about from a privacy perspective. I'll address just sort of the value of privacy now, but before I do that, does anyone have any clarifying questions or thoughts about those before I opine on values of privacy? I welcome questions, lots of them. I like them. Yes?
When you said for number 3, you were talking about like this important ways in which to actually regulate expectations.
Mm-hmm.
An open what idea, like what's just like an example of what you mean by that?
So I'll talk about this in a little bit, but I think that the work that Bruce does on, for example, like polling people, if you can clearly establish that, like there was some poll I read that said like 91% of people expect the law to be enforced. Great, let's enforce it. If you can get 80, 90% thresholds of societal understanding or belief that X thing ought to be private, then we should probably regulate around that. And I'll talk about that in a little because there's a Supreme Court precedent that relates to that as well. Does that answer your question?
What was the third one again?
Social expectations. So if a practice or law happens that violates our social expectations for privacy, I think we should be really concerned. And also that, like, as the like offset to that is we should protect our social expectations. Other questions?
No, but could you just restate the question so everybody can hear it?
Sure. The question was, what was the third one? And your question was?
Just an example of what you meant by regulating the expectations of people.
An example of regulating the expectations of people. Sorry, thank you. Yes?
Maybe we're going to talk about this later, but is there a tension-filled relationship at all between our social expectations and technology, right? So the court famously talks about a reasonable expectation of privacy with respect to the Fourth Amendment, how it might apply to technological innovation, but part of what's remarkable about technology in 2013 and going forward is the rate of rapid change and how it unsettles our expectations. So while I understand the merits of an expectations-driven, not policy, but framework, is it inherently problematic given that we're talking about expectations and privacy, expectations regarding lots of other things, maybe more stable perhaps, but is this an area where the two are at odds?
Question was, is there a problem to try and regulate technology that's moving so rapidly based on precedents that are slower to happen when technology is moving so quickly? I think there is a lot of tension there, but I think the solution is essentially to find, and I'll talk more about this in a second, but I think the general solution there is to find broad areas of societal agreement. And I think that's actually pretty easy to do. And I think the other side of it is to, I think like a lot of the problem actually happens from like the political side of just like hyper-partisanship and other things that have kind of crippled legislative progress. But I'll talk about that in a second. But thank you. So I'll talk now for a second about what I think the value of privacy is, and happily, again, bring on the questions as we go, if you'd like. So I think that like a general straw man argument that people raise against privacy is sort of the idea of like, why do you care about your privacy if like you haven't done anything wrong? And like people will say that, and it's like, you know, why do you care about like having the government read your emails if you like haven't written anything wrong? And my response to that question is always like, to most people, would you be comfortable with someone putting a camera in your shower and projecting your showers onto the internet? And mostly people say no, if you ask them that. And my point is we're not doing anything wrong when we're bathing, but we don't want everyone to see it or know about it. Similarly, if you are in like most of the conversations that we have as people, you wouldn't want that to be publicly and worldwide available. And I think that there's an evolutionary reason for that as well, which is that when we're faced with moments of uncertainty as people, there are like certain things that we do to resolve our uncertainty. We look to things like signaling factors from authority figures, from like your parents or teachers or professors, from celebrities. You look for what your peers are doing. You try and be consistent as a person with what you've done in the past. You try and figure out the path of kind of least friction to solving your problem. But as anyone who's had a camera pointed at them knows, when what you're doing is being constantly projected or watched publicly, we behave differently. And you actually act differently. And there's a way in which, because we have so much of our information exposed now and being watched, like my little sister's in high school, and like she has like had teachers who talk to her about like how she should behave in social media, because that could be something that impacts her when she applies to college. But that's crazy. I did so many stupid things when I was in high school, and thankfully they never made it onto the internet. But I think that there's a really big problem if everything that we're doing is constantly publicly available, or could be publicly available, or could be watched. And we know that it's being watched because we have fewer and fewer moments of like personal uncertainty in which we can just decide what we want to do without the friction of deciding like how is this going to be publicly perceived or consumed. And I think that there's also a way in which like that's how we let friendship and love and like personal growth happen. Like friendships happen within safe spaces where you can like be like confident that what you're saying remains between you and that person. And your personal development happens in safe spaces where you know that you can just like make decisions for yourself, and where you don't have to deal with like incoming bombardment of media or suggestions or something like that. And so I think that generally kind of like to foreground that into philosophy or sort of a philosophical notion, I think there are like two types of values that we have as a society. One is instrumental goods, and that's something like money, where you trade it for something. Like you want to like get something in exchange for what you're giving away. The other one is intrinsic goods, which are things like equality or democracy or liberty, or things that we think just have an inherent worth to them. I don't think, the problem with privacy is it's not clearly either. Like it's not clearly an intrinsic good in and of itself where we like aspire to have it or think that it's like, you know, as like ultimately important for people's development as like liberty or equality. But also it feels a little crude to say that it's instrumental because we're not trading our privacy off for anything. And so just a second, I will get to it. Is I think that like so what I would say about like why I think privacy is valuable is I think it's a safe space for us as people and us as a society to pursue broader instrumental good or intrinsic goods like love, like friendship, like personal growth, like coming into the certainty of who you are and like what kinds of ways you want to interact with the world when you're faced with moments of uncertainty, or when you're faced with moments of just like being alone and deciding what you're going to do without having to worry about it being watched or projected or the government or corporations knowing about it. And so I think that the problem is when you could be or are being constantly having your privacy invaded, it makes it harder and harder to have those real moments of political discourse with people where you're not worried about it like coming back to haunt you, or like where you can just kind of explore conversations with people who you love or want to get to know, or you can explore thoughts and ideas by yourself or in a safe space of like where you know that your information and thoughts are secure. I realize that was a lot, and like also people probably feel differently than I do about some of this. So, and I know you had a question as well, so I'd love to hear questions. Other questions, of course, equally welcome.
What was the first type of values that we have in society?
I think we have two types of like general values. I think you have like intrinsic values, which are something like it's valuable in and of itself. That's like equality or liberty or something. And then you have instrumental values, which are things like money or something that we trade off. Other questions? Yes?
Why exactly is it that you think privacy is not literally an intrinsic value?
I don't think that it offers, I don't think it's a prerequisite to creating a society to have privacy. No. Because I think that there are societies that exist with, and like our own included, where we have exceptionally like small amounts of privacy. Like everywhere that we go, pretty much everything, like you could, like someone can figure out where you are. Like, and anything that like we write, anything that you buy, like we have an exceptionally small amount of privacy as a country, and yet like we continue to function as a pretty decent country. I'm concerned about the way that it's happening, but I don't think that like it's on the level of importance of or destructiveness to take it away as like disenfranchisement would be.
Well, we'll disagree on that.
Sure.
When we're taking questions, we can use the mic, so.
Yeah. Oh, I'm the worst. I'm sorry.
Not your fault.
You say you work with Facebook?
I do.
You do, okay. So how do you feel about how like Facebook kind of like, on your phone, like Facebook automatically takes your contacts, your friends' contacts, and their information and stores it on your phone? How do you feel about that, like kind of invasion of privacy?
Sure. So what you're talking about is called a contact import.
Yeah.
So we don't automatically do that, and actually it would be illegal for us or any company to do that. Most companies that do things like that, like any like broad technological company, you actually have to validate that they do it before any company could do it. So you have to say that it's acceptable to do a contact sync.
Oh, okay.
But I think the broader question that you're asking is something like, correct me if I'm wrong, but sort of like what it means to let lots of like companies just sort of grasp a hold of your information. I think that it's really important that, and like this is something I work on at Facebook, and I think it's very important that companies have really robust controls, both on the front end when you validate that and make that decision that you trust a company to give them your information, but also like if you change your mind, you should be able to delete your information and have ongoing control over it. And actually in the EU, there's a lot more robust measures around this where you have like a right of deletion and a right of access, where companies have to give you any information that that they have about you. And so like what I would say is I'm not really concerned about companies like Facebook and Google, because clearly I work at them. And here's why, is we have a user-facing interaction. Because like it's in Facebook's best interest and Google's best interest for you to trust us and for you to like use the platform. Companies that I don't trust are companies that don't have a user-facing interaction. The companies that just are like these large-scale data brokers that just have platforms of information of like about 200 or 300 million Americans that they just buy through like your rewards cards, Like if you have like a CVS reward card, they buy like public information about you, like ringtones.com, like free ringtones and stuff. They just buy those phone numbers and they just bundle this information and just sell it. And those are the companies that I'm worried about because they don't have to give you the information they have about you. They just sell it and they just traffic it about you. And that's what I'm worried about at a first level. The second one is the government, but that's a longer discussion, which I hope to get into in a moment. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
All right.
Sure. Okay, so I've been on and off Facebook over the past couple years, but what I wonder about Facebook is when someone like friend requests me, I wonder why I can't see their full profile when they friend request me. Like if I was to friend request somebody, I would think that would kind of give all my privacy settings kind of would step aside a bit, because if that person, say they don't know me just from my profile picture, they could just, if they just see my profile picture, they won't really know who I am. So if all my privacy settings were to go away because I friend requested somebody, then they would be able to identify who I am. I was wondering why that hasn't really been.
Sure. So we have a public profile policy, or like a real names policy, where people have to have their real name with their profile. But the broader question I think that you're asking is why doesn't it change if you make a request to someone? And actually, that's an intentional design request, or that's an intentional design, because we always want people to be able to control what people can and can't see about them. So you can always set your profile to public, or like friends or friends of friends, or like any element on your profile, like any individual picture, any of these things. It has a little custom privacy icon on it that you can change at any point to give people access to it. And so that, like, once you have validated someone's or accepted someone's friend request, or they've accepted yours, then you can get like friend level information. But the idea is we always want people to be able to have like precise control over their information. And like one of the most important private things that are on Facebook is your friend list. And like once someone's your friend list, then like the privacy settings change. But we don't change it just if someone makes a friend request or not. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it was kind of it was in between. It was at that point where someone requests you and you haven't accepted them yet.
Yep.
Like I know that everybody, once someone friend requests them, they go right to their profile, they check them out. Okay, who is this person requesting me? So I'm just wondering, like, why can't we see their information, because they're the ones requesting us? You know what I mean?
The idea is to always give everyone full control over their information. And so, like, it would be like an additional category that we would have to create that would be like requested friends, or like friend requests that you've sent. And I think the general like policy that we have is trying to make things as clear and precise as possible. So you can always share to like only me, friends, friends of friends, public, custom. And so like friend request sent would be like an additional kind of like oddity. And I think that like I currently agree with the way that we do it, because I think it means that people always have control over what they're like, who they've shared with. Do you have a question?
I actually had two questions,
Ooh,
but one of them's
doubleheader.
really quick. You were talking about how they get access to your information through, like, you use cards like at the movies, stuff like that.
Yeah.
When you go on all these sites now where you can pay and get any information you want, and even when you don't pay now, like I'll put my name in and it'll show where I live, how old I am, who lives with me. Is that where that information is coming from?
It depends.
How do they get that? It's creepy.
It depends. That's a very broad discussion, and I'm happy to recommend some books for you if you'd like, because there are books about that kind of thing. The short answer is they get it from everywhere.
Okay.
There are like broad, like
Right.
trading.
Same way they would
there
get
are,
like your email
marketplaces.
information and all that
Yeah.
stuff. Okay.
There are like marketplaces about your information.
Okay.
And a really interesting thing to do is like create an alternative email account and just like sign it up for different things and just see where it goes. Like see what types of spam you start getting, because there are places that just sell, like they just traffic in this information. And so like if you ever like, like if you sign up for like a sweepstakes, like they'll, that information is very valuable to people. Because like if you sign up for a sweepstakes and say like, I'm like X type of person in X place, and like X gender, blah, blah, blah. That allows for like better and better targeting.
Right, and you notice the more that you sign up for things, the more you start getting spam mail. So I mean,
exactly.
creepy. But and the other thing was, you were talking about, like for example, you used the analogy of someone not wanting to be filmed or have a camera in their shower and such, and that they have that expectation of privacy. But when it comes to like Facebook and Twitter, my thought is, I'm really not a fan of Facebook, but only because of such things, because people are getting, like employers are looking them up and stuff. But the thing is, they're choosing to do so, knowing when they go into it what to expect. So that's why I'm wondering, what level of privacy, how can you expect that much of a level of privacy going into something like that where you know what can happen?
Sure. Which brings me to the next thing that I want to talk about, which is why I think like privacy is pretty gnarly to regulate. So you have this problem, which is that people like go actively to the internet to give away their information. And it becomes really hard to like protect people's privacy or to encourage people to protect their privacy, because most of the components of rational choice theory fly in the face of how we interact with privacy. For example, it's impossible to know, as you just said, or as we were just talking about, the future consequences of sharing your information. I cannot predict the negative consequences that would happen if I gave someone my social security number or paid for a pair of shoes on a sketchy looking website. That could have nothing happen, or that could have vast, drastic consequences to my life and to my happiness. And so it's really difficult to forecast and predict and like rationally interact with the privacy trade-offs that we make. Also, privacy is incredibly complex, just in the scope of like what we do and don't share, and like how you know who's getting what information and all of these kinds of things. And the other thing is something that Bruce alluded to earlier, which is that technology is just compoundingly getting better and better and better. If you think about like flip phones, which most of us probably had 5 years ago and which I still use, flip phones in comparison to the iPhone, like that is a leaps and bounds change, right? And so you have all of these things like Moore's law and all of these things that like basically like chips get like, or like all these things about like chips getting twice as effective every year, and sort of like something that like we've noticed at Facebook, which is people want to share twice as much information as they did the previous year, and like all of these like new things that get pretty complex, and sort of like insert statistics here about wireless and growth of Wi-Fi and internet access, et cetera, because it doesn't like it doesn't take a study to look around and realize how much crazier technology is every year, and it's crazier than it was the previous year. And so you have all these compounding problems that happen with privacy, where even if you could get good legislation on the books, it would be outdated in a year, right? Like how do you, and so that allows for all of these problems like permanent cookies. Like if you clear your cookies on your computer now, there are these like perpetual cookies, there's like beacon cookies and all of these things, where if you clear your cookies, there are cookies that will still stay on your computer and keep transmitting your information back. Wonderful product, if you'd like to look at it, is a product called Ghostery or AdBlock Plus. These are wonderful, and they will show you all of the cookies that are being run on your computer at any given moment. Ghostery, it's Ghost E-R-Y. And you can download it and run it on your browser, and it'll show you all the cookies that are tracking you. And you're like, what is that? That's not even like English. Like, I don't know how this site, because lots of sites, when you visit that website, they let other sites or other companies that are third parties, and these are again the third parties that I'm concerned about, they let third parties drop cookies on your browser, and they just will gather information about you and build a profile that they can sell to someone to market to you later. And that's kind of like why if you Google something or like go to a certain website, you suddenly get inundated with ads for that particular product. I'm sure you've all had this experience. Sort of. It depends. It depends. There are like perpetual cookies that you can't delete, even if you reset your cookies. And there are other things that happen of like every device that you have like has what's called a MAC address on it. It's like a device ID. And that's uniquely identifiable to your device. You can find it on your phone or on your computer. And unless you spoof that, which is very difficult to do, that's your device ID that anytime you're connected to a Wi-Fi router, or anytime, like, you notice like when you're like walking around, you can see what Wi-Fi networks are out there. That's because your device is sending information that's like, hey, are you there? Are you there? Are you there? To Wi-Fi routers, and they can see who you are constantly. And like if you're on an IP address, so there's another great thing called Panopticlick. I recommend visiting it. It's something run by a group called the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They are awesome. And they have found that like most of the time, most people's, because anytime you go to a website, like you'll notice if you've ever gone to a website and it says like, your version of Adobe is outdated. Has you ever had this experience? Your version of Flash is outdated. Go download it. How do you think it knows that? Because your computer is telling it what version of Adobe or Flash you're running. And not just Adobe or Flash, but most of your software on your computer and the hardware that you're running. And so that means that they can see tons of stuff about like what kind of computer you're running because like they have to be able to see that to interact with your browser and to be able to interact with your computer. But once they do that, that's a really, really easy thing to uniquely fingerprint you for in the future. And so the Panopticlick has found that most of the time, most people have like, their like settings are like one in like between like 200,000 and 2 million levels of uniqueness. So like you are like 1 in 2 million like that. So most of the time when I go to Panopticlick, it's like you're the first person in like 3 million people we've looked at that have your settings. So anywhere you go, it's pretty easy to recognize you because they don't even need a cookie if they have all that information about you. So that's one reason why regulating technology can get pretty tricky. Further questions? I don't mean to scare all of you too much, but this is kind of like something I live in terror of. Yes?
I know before you were saying that we don't have much privacy in our country, and I kind of know where you're coming from, but I think that we definitely have our fair share of privacy, so I just want to know what you mean by we don't have a lot of privacy.
Sure. I'll get into that in a second when we talk about legislation about this.
I'd like to answer the question this gentleman just asked. I come from a time when there was privacy, at least to a great extent, and then there was a book published called 1984, which predicted what's going on now. And if you don't understand, there's a big difference between having privacy and not having it today. As far as I'm concerned, once they put in the Social Security numbers, they gave up our privacy. I've been fighting that all my life.
Yeah, have you read Orwell's essay, Politics in the English Language? Wonderful. It kind of provided the bedrock of where 1984 went, and it talks a lot about like the linguistic problems with like what happened with 1984. But like, I totally agree. We should talk afterwards, I'm on camera, about various ways that you can avoid certain personally identifiable characteristics about yourself. Yes.
Matt, I have two questions. One alludes to something that the young lady said over there. In regards to the privacy for applying to college, jobs, and so forth, if you have your friends-only setting, how do the journalists and the employers get the information? Is it that they're going, because you can see a list of friends, even if you're not friends with that person.
No, you can shut off your friends list. So only people who are your friends can see your friends.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on Facebook. My kids are.
Happy to
but
show
I'm
you.
not.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that because I assumed they would be going to friends of yours to go get the pictures and the other information because you have yours set to friends only.
Yep. That's what they will do, but you can also shut off your friends list to make it only available to friends. Which is why I said I think it's like actually probably the most important of all your things on Facebook is your friends list in terms of like what you should be able to control.
But if you go on a friend of mine
Yep.
and they have me tagged on a picture, you can see that picture if they don't have a security setting.
It depends on various access things. So you can always tag anyone, but it doesn't mean that I can see anything on your profile aside from sort of like the public things about you.
Oh, not my profile, but any pictures or comments, whatever, on my friend's Facebook.
So the general...
Because they know they're my friend.
So I think that like, because I envision many people have questions about Facebook's privacy model, I'll just briefly cover what our model is, which is kind of like how everything trickles down. Basically, you can always say something about someone else, and tag them. And then you control the privacy on the thing that you say or post. So if I post a picture that's a public picture, I control the privacy on that. But if I tag someone in it, they control the way that their tags happen. So you can say, I don't want to be tagged in anything. For example, I use this. There's a feature that we have that I always tell people they should use called timeline review, where before anything shows up on your profile, you can review it and say whether or not you want it to show up on your profile. And so all of these things are basically like, we let people who post content always have privacy over their timeline and their content. And everything cascades down from there. So if I'm commenting on a public post that someone else has made, like their picture public, and I'm commenting on it, that will be public because they've tagged the privacy of that post as being public already. And so I'm participating in their post. Does that answer your question? All right.
The other question that I had is, lately the controversy that I've seen is when companies or organizations are posting things on Facebook and they have 2 million likes and 300,000 comments. If you go ahead and like that, my understanding is they can pick up whatever information they have from your Facebook profile. Is that correct?
No. It's complicated. But again, a lot of it goes back to like your settings, where it's kind of like, if you've, it depends on like how much you want to validate. So if you like validate an app, they get more information about you. So a lot of it comes back to like what you've set your settings to be allowed to, like to allow other people to see. And that's like both on an individual level, like when you like, post something and there's a little icon that you can always set that says like public, friends, custom, blah, blah, blah. And also like your general settings. So an easy way to kind of like interact with that is if you go into like your profile now, there's a place that you can go kind of in the top left where you can press a lock and it shows you like 3 or 4 questions. Go there and just kind of like poke around and it answers a lot of your questions. Better than I will, because they're like people who are employed to write those things well. Others? Yes.
I'm actually taking a social media class right now, and we were discussing about lifespan that could potentially be put on things that you put online. I know that's not really applicable right now, but it's like a possibility for like the future.
When you say lifespan, you mean it will deprecate? Like it deletes itself
yeah,
after
it just
certain...
disappears.
That happens. Have you used Snapchat?
No.
Snapchat does that, and so does Poke. We have a Facebook app that does that, where you can send something and set how long the other person can see it for. So I can send you a message, and you see it for 1 to 10 seconds. And then it just deletes, and we delete it out of our systems too. And if you take a screenshot of it, it will tell me that you've taken a screenshot.
Do you think that it's going to develop further, like later on in the future? Like
Definitively. I think that's the future of like a lot of sharing models, is like allowing people to have like permanent ongoing control and retention over their data and deletability.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
And Poke and Snapchat do that right now.
Matt, I was wondering if you can comment on a rumor, and I'm sure every other college student has heard of this, that when you're getting ready to apply for a job, there's this rumor, I don't know whether it's true or not, that potential employers somehow get access to your Facebook and are able to see all your information, your pictures, your posts. Is that true or not?
No, not unless they go through like one of your friends. And I know like this will happen, but there's also even like, I know there's been like colleges now that have, or like some states have said, because like employers will occasionally, and I've read about this, and we're like really strongly, we are very against this as a company, where employers will say like, give me your Facebook password, and like I want to see your profile. We really oppose that. We think that like that should like not happen, and there are states even now that I think have like, this is completely conjecture at this point, but I think I've read that there are states that have actually made that illegal. But we do not do that ever for employers. Like we wouldn't give someone's information to someone like that. There could be the route where an employer kind of says, like, finds someone in their organization who's Facebook friends with that person and says, I want you to give me that person's information. And that's a way that could happen. But as far as, like, do we release that or do employers have some special relationship with us? No, not at all.
What about the government?
We have to, and this is a perfect moment to transition. And so this is why I am, like, so scared of the government's involvement in privacy. So let me talk about, all right, I'll talk about the Patriot Act. Well, I'll talk about 3 pieces of legislation that I think are relevant to this discussion. The first is something called the Privacy Act, like US Privacy Act. It was passed in the 70s, kind of in the shadow of Watergate. And the Privacy Act is supposed to regulate the use of information, but it only applies to the government. And the problem with this is that the government abuses it in so many fascinating ways. For example, one study of the applicability of the Privacy Act found that federal agencies were sharing information about visitors to their websites. 23 federal agencies had shared information about the people who were visiting their websites. 4 of those federal agencies shared that information with banks, employers, retailers, and marketers. So this is like, you go to a website, your government's website, they get the information about you, like from cookies or from you interacting with it, and then they give that information to a bank. I think that's rather atrocious. But like, this is the state of the Privacy Act. And I think that, like, the Privacy Act really, like, explicitly, if you read the law on it, would forbid this kind of thing. Like, openly. It says, like, they're, like, the only way that the government should be able to gather and collect information is if they have an explicit stated purpose for what they're gathering, and then they have to fulfill that stated purpose. But congressmen find loops around this by, for example, they gather information, they release it, and like tons of it at the time, and then they pay someone to bundle up everything that they've released. They buy it back with your taxpayer dollars so then that they know more about you so they can target you for voting. That happens. And like, it's clearly, I think, like a rational view of it is that it's illegal. But like, you know, who is Congress to enforce laws upon themselves? And I think this raises concerns of all 3 types of the privacy things that I talked about. 1 is it's illegal. I think. 2, it's an unenforced law. And 3, it clearly violates our social expectations. I hope that when I told you this, your social expectations were, you felt like you had been violated because that happened. Because that should be, it shouldn't be allowed. The second is something called the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. It was passed in 1986, and it regulates all of your electronic communications, which is lovely, because if you think about it, like, this is years before something like internet email happened, or like text messaging or anything like this. And so there's all these like convoluted distinctions that happen, because this was written in an era in which records could actually be destroyed. You could destroy a physical record. And so this means, though, that in effect, there are all these like weird Passover problems that happen where like emails that are in transit, like if you send an email, it has different privacy settings, like before someone opens it and after they open it. Or if it's stored remotely or on like a server. Or like if it's in transit or not. So there's all these like weird distinctions. But like, I don't think that there's any different privacy on my email inbox when I open an email as opposed to like if I don't open it. Because that's really just a timing question, right? Like, when do I open it? Like, when I see it. That doesn't interact, I think, like successfully with our social expectations for privacy, that there should be different thresholds of how the government can get a hold of an email depending on whether or not I've opened it or how long it's been in my inbox. Because once it's been in my inbox, even because it has more protection if it's unopened. Once it's been in your inbox unopened for 180 days, it reverts to the lower threshold. Again, doesn't really make any sense. But this is just how courts have applied ECPA because they don't have any better guidance from Congress on how to interact with it. The third one that I'm most concerned about is something called the Patriot Act, which I'm sure you've heard of. And I'll only highlight one brief component of it because people have written books about the Patriot Act. National security letters are this fabulous mechanism that the FBI uses to get anything that they want to about you. So every year they issue about between 2003 and 2006, they were issuing 50,000 of these. And a bunch of them were for American citizens, a bunch of them weren't. non-American citizens. Basically what they do is they don't have to, it doesn't go through, they don't need probable cause, it doesn't go through a court, they don't need a judge. The FBI just says, I think that information about Matt is relevant to my ongoing investigation. And so they go to a company and they say, give us all the information you have about Matt. It comes with a gag order, so you can't say that you got it. So even if like this happened recently with like Twitter and stuff, even if I have an agreement with a company that says if you're going to release my information, you have to tell me, that's illegal for them to follow through with their terms that in which they've stated that they have to tell me if they're going to give away my information. So yeah, I mean, why wouldn't you comply? It's against the law not to comply. So and it gets better, don't worry. So you have to, like, you can't say that you had it, you got it. There's a gag order. You can't challenge it because there's no due process and there's no probable cause that goes with it because it was never validated by a judge in the first place. And here's the best part is if you comply with it in good faith, you are completely like off the hook for future criminal or civil proceedings against you if you've proceeded in good faith. So let's say, for example, that like, you know, some company comes to Bruce, and Bruce is like a financial holder, like Google or something like that. And they're like, give us all the information that you have about Matt. And he says, I have an agreement with Matt that says I won't give away his information unless I tell him. And they say, you can't tell him. You can't challenge it back into court. And like, but in the future, if he ever finds out that you gave us his information and wants to sue you, if you comply with us in good faith, you can't be held criminally or civilly responsible for what you did. And guess who judges whether he complied in good faith? The FBI themselves. So there's this incredibly perverse system that encourages you to comply with them on everything that they do. And there's like and it's really funny if you read like the audits of these that like the Department of Justice has done, because it's like people complain about like us not having thresholds or guidance for what we should do to issue national security letters. That's not true. We have guidelines. Here they are. 6 or 7 lines, all blacked out. And it has like a footnote, and it's like, this is classified. But here's the even crazier part is the DOJ did an audit of them, and they found that they had violated, in a sample that they took, they had violated their own internal rules in 10% of the cases that they audited them on. And it's like, how do you even break the rules if there aren't any? It's kind of like, it's just like shocking to me that there is some way that you could break the rules, because it's like, I cannot for the life of me think of the ways there aren't rules. It doesn't apply, it applies to Americans and non-Americans. It applies to anything ever about you. I just like, it's shocking to me that they could even break the rules. But clearly, it's like, you know, go figure, this is the FBI. So this is why I'm concerned about the government, is because like on top of that, senators who are like deeply familiar with the Patriot Act have said and accused, and the FBI has like obviously not responded, but they've basically complained and said the Department of Justice has secret interpretations of the Patriot Act. Literally, secret interpretations, like internal memos that they've written, and they're like, this is how we interpret the Patriot Act. But they won't tell you what it is, so like we can never actually know what it is. And so I think like that's really concerning from a societal perspective, because like, how can we ever expect to like participate in a democracy or like be participants in a society if we're not even allowed to know what the government thinks about the laws that are passed? And if the government can break those laws, which they clearly do all the time, and like there's no enforcement mechanism against them. And I think that's really troubling. I'm going to jump ahead and hit a few Supreme Court cases because I think that they're equally crazy, and then happy to take questions. So there's a case in 1967 called Kyoto v. United States, which established a very important precedent, which I think is very applicable in this discussion. Basically, it's a two-step like process for determining whether there should be a right to privacy. The first is, did the person in question have a subjective or like personal expectation of their privacy? Second is that an expectation that society is prepared to recognize? So if I have an expectation that's crazy, like that no one should be able to like look at me if I'm like, you know, walking around naked in a park, clearly that's not one that society is prepared to recognize. But if society is prepared to recognize what I'm working on, what I'm like have an expectation about, then that's something that should be protected. And that is the Supreme Court's process for making these decisions. However, there are two wildly interesting examples of the applicability of this recently. One is a case that had to do with GPS tracking, and this happened a few years ago. This was 2010. Basically, police officer had put a GPS device on a car, tracked them all over, gathered tons of information about them. And there's all these great quotes from the police officer that are like, you know, it's great, like I never would have had to do this before, before this kind of surveillance would have required like 50 people. Now we can have surveillance on like thousands of people from and never have to leave like where I'm sitting. And it's like, because they don't have to watch people actively anymore. And that's another example of where I think like technology is making this really complex to actually regulate, because like that's just a different life. Like that's a different world than 10 years ago where you would have had to actually go out into the world and like watch a person. Now you can just stick a GPS on their car. And the court ruled, yeah. Yeah, so it's gone back and forth. The court hasn't reversed that precedent, though. The precedent that came out of it was basically, though, that like they said there could be a social expectation or like a societal expectation of privacy around GPS tracking, but that ruling on that would lead needlessly into thorny issues. Even though like broadly again and again, polls have demonstrated that like people think that like the police should have warrants if they're going to be tracking you on your car. Second great example of this is a recent one where a police officer was engaging in illicit text messaging on his work two-way pager. So I've never used a two-way pager, but I'm familiar with them from having looked them up on the internet. It seems to work something like a cell phone, but with extraordinarily limited functionality. So you can kind of like send back and forth messages, and that's all it does. In 2012, the court ruled that there's a potential that there could be a societal expectation that we have privacy over our text messages, and that could be a social expectation. But they don't want to engage that question or answer it yet because there are still unresolved social expectations around two-way pagers because they called them an emerging technology. Two-way pagers have been around for over 20 years. If you think two-way pagers are an emerging technology, I've got an iPhone 5 that's going to blow your mind. And like, that's a big problem. And another part of this is kind of like the natural ebb and flow of the fact that the court doesn't get cases until 4 or 5 years after the incident that triggered the case actually occurs. So they don't get to rule on it until well after the case. But nonetheless, I think like that's another circumstance in which like, to kind of like discuss like how we could trigger deciding whether there's a social expectation there. There are lots of wonderful places that do research where they ask people, do you think you should have social privacy, or like, do you have a societal expectation that you should have privacy over your text messages? And if 80 or 90 people are saying yes, which they clearly would, then like that should be something that the court rules and says, oh, there's like a social expectation on the individual level and at the societal level that we're prepared to recognize that this is something that people expect to have privacy over. And it's not that, I don't think it's like I haven't even gone to law school, and like I don't think that's like a terribly like thoughtful approach to it. It just seems like pretty intuitive to me that like that's kind of like a pretty easy way to resolve a lot of these questions is if you want to know what people in society think about emerging technologies, just ask them. And like they'll tell you, and if enough of them think that like they should have that they should have certain privacy around certain elements of their life or technology or space or information, then like recognize that. So that's so legislation. Did you have a question, by the way? These things are always like fascinatingly ongoing. US v. Jones is the case, and then the other one is Ontario v. Quine. Ontario v. Quine, it happened in California. And that was about, it was a police officer's two-way device. It was his like work device. And so he asserted that he should have privacy over his text messages. His HR department felt otherwise and went in and read them. And so that was kind of like where he made a Fourth Amendment claim, claiming that he had privacy over them, and the court felt otherwise. Or didn't address the question, sorry. Like just thought that it was like an emerging technology that they shouldn't grapple with. So I'd love to hit briefly on like another component of this, which is like why I think privacy can be so difficult to regulate. So I think there are a couple moving targets here. One of them is the fact that if you think about how privacy, or if you think about how Congress regulates, a lot of it is, there's kind of like two different regulatory models that I think we could invoke. One is the idea of something of a kind of like fire alarm model. The other one is sort of like police patrol model. Police patrol model is Congress goes out and like finds problems and like checks in on whether legislation is being enforced and like is preemptive about like problems that are happening. Like a police officer who's patrolling the streets, you know, they're just like looking to make sure that all is well and that like the law is being enforced. The other model that Congress could use, which will probably sound much more familiar to you, is they act like a fire alarm. They wait until there's a problem, and then they throw all that they can at it and like get all the headlines that they can out of it and try and solve that problem. Why would they pursue the fire alarm one over the police patrol model? I think the answer is pretty simple if you just assume like that most politicians' agendas are to re-elect themselves. I don't think that's a particularly controversial claim. And no congressman or senator or president has ever run for office successfully on the claim of, I prevented 8 problems from happening that otherwise would have happened, because you can't prove that. And so it's much better for them if their problem arises and then citizens and advocacy groups bear the pain of this, do the research, trump up a claim or make a claim when there's a real claim, and then the congressman can have these awesome, you know, drag Barry Bonds in front of lots of different congressmen so they can yell and scream about the downfall of morality in baseball, or, you know, scream about hip hop lyrics and how bad they are. And so it's like, you know, it's a great way for them to grab a headline. And then like for them to, you know, use the fact that they can write that like they're the only people in the country who can use the postal service for free, and they've already got information about you that they gleaned from buying it from you or back about you with your taxpayer dollars after they released it. And then they can just write to you and tell you about all these great problems that they've solved. And so that's one thing is like, there's not a real need for Congress to get involved because it's not really a big problem. Like, there's no one who's really, like, aside from like a couple advocacy groups that we work with and like I love and think are awesome. If you want to look them up, my favorites are the Center for Democracy and Technology. They put out awesome work. The Electronic Frontier Foundation and the Electronic Privacy Information Center. They all do awesome work. But they aren't mainstream. Not a lot of people know about them. The ACLU is a little more mainstream, but privacy isn't their focus. And so you have this problem where there's not like a lobby for privacy, right? But like, you know, tobacco, oil, like, you know, they're gonna get the attention, right? That's where like the money's coming in from. That's also where there are problems that people are raising. People are complaining about those. And this is another complexity of privacy, is that like most people don't know a lot about privacy. They don't understand what's happening. You know, it's kind of like, I would hope that all of you feel like you've learned something either about privacy or technology from me. I learn something every day at work about how technology works. And like, that's what I've been doing for the past 2 years, is like working in like tech and privacy. Because it's so complex, like all the different complex ways that information can like be gathered about people and protected or not protected or leaked or retained or deleted or not deleted. And so it's incredibly complex. So that's another problem, is, and you have that, the fact that like there's no lobby for it. It's not a big explosive problem yet, so Congress doesn't have incentive to regulate it or to come back and interact with it. Most people in Congress, if you've ever sort of like watched Supreme Court arguments about this, about like, you know, that have to do with technology, or heard like hearings that like in Congress or this, you know, Senate or something like this, or, you know, like most, unfortunately, like most of our leaders don't get technology, and like they're not technologists. And so that's another big problem, is it's not in their wheelhouse. Like most of them are lawyers. And like, they didn't study like computer science or systems engineering or electrical engineering or something like that. And those people don't run for office, and they're not in office, and they're not like interested in being in politics. And so I think like at a very like base level, those are like complicated issues. That like those are reasons why it's like very hard to regulate privacy. There are other like interagency problems that have to do with the FTC and like other regulatory issues that I think exist. But I would like to open it up if people have questions. Also, I'm sorry if I'm like really cynical or depressing. I don't mean for this talk to be that way. It's just like, once I start going, it's like, no one ever listens to me at work. So this is great to get to, it's like no one wants to hear my rants anymore.
So my question is, you seem to be somebody who's been steeped in this world for a while and thinking about questions of privacy and the problems with it. And you seem to be, concerned about the state of it. So what do you do when you live in a world where people really only get up in arms about privacy violations when, it involves them? I mean, I think the vast majority of people, you're right, if you were to ask them questions about the extent to which they want these things, they would say yes. But the reality is that most people treat, I think, privacy violations kind of with a collective yawn. So how have you thought about this? What can you do to try to engender more concern in the public about these privacy violations and the way the government is treating these issues?
Sure. And so I think that like sort of like a solution-oriented idea is I think like the prerequisite to us solving any of our problems is education. Is like people need to get what's happening. And like, until that happens, no one's gonna care. I think people are starting to get that. And I think that like, quite frankly, my view is that like, the way that like a big piece of legislation might finally coalesce and occur is if like a senator or Supreme Court justice or like a president or someone in their family, if their privacy is like explosively compromised. And I think like that is how, like that will be the first step towards like passing legislation, or like a vast user education drive where like like it becomes salient to us. And I think it's becoming more and more salient, right? Like if I'd given this talk a couple years ago, I couldn't have given this talk, first of all, because like all of these technologies didn't exist then. And second, like most people in here wouldn't have been as concerned about it. And so I think it's becoming something that people are more aware of. But I think that the first step, frankly, is education. Because that's what will allow there to be sort of like, because there are like broad organizations that are creating kind of like different advocacy groups or like working groups that are coming together from like government and business and like politics and stuff like that. And those groups I think are going to be like the kind of like hub of where education happens and like how these kinds of like broader discussions get kicked off. At a personal level, I try and talk about it. I wrote a paper about it, which I'm happy to share with anyone who wants to read. And like, I try not to share information that like, I don't want people to, like I've never used a rewards card. And like, I'm pretty careful about my information and like, try and help people who are like my friends or who want to talk about it with theirs. But I think like the first step, because all of the other things around like deadlock and like all of the other issues that I just mentioned about like congressional problems, those are all resolvable issues once things get kicked off, right? Like once there's a big moment where people are like, aha, like we need to solve this. Those are resolvable. That's why nothing's happened yet, is because people don't get it.
To what extent do you blame the media for not informing us about this? That is to say, do you think the media has some kind of vested interest in maintaining, just not much information out there about this?
I don't think. I think a problem with the media is like they don't get it either. Like if most people who I think get it are people who would much rather be involved with building technology than like working in politics, right? Like I would trust almost like any of my friends who are engineers who I get to work with, who are just like incredibly brilliant and thoughtful people, like I would love to have them at the FTC, but why would they go there? Like they get to wear, like I wear this to work. Like, my friends at Google and Facebook wear like shorts and t-shirts to work. We get free food. They like coddle you all the time. You go work at the FTC, it's like you wear a suit. It takes 5 years to get anything done. And it's like a thankless job. And so I think the other part of it is like that kind of part of it where it's like you have to figure out how to attract people into being in like regulatory positions or involved with it or expert testimony or something like that, so they can start informing the people who need to know who have chosen that lifestyle. And another like brief addendum to that is there's a great paper out there called Separation of Parties, Not Powers, which is like well worth reading because it discusses another reason why I think like things have not kicked off is because ultimately, the way that things happen, and I think like orientation of power in the country is around like separation of parties. It's like what's good for a Democrat is good for a Democrat all the way up and down the ticket. Like if I'm like running for governor, it doesn't matter what policies Barack Obama is advocating, it matters that Barack Obama wins. And so this is why it's like funny where it's like if George Bush had been like trying to use drones and had a kill list, Democrats would have been up in arms about it. Barack Obama has drones and a kill list, and it's like national security. You know, like, and it's, you see that both ways. Like it flips like all over the place. Because it's like, there's not like principled positions, there are like party positions that matter. And so there's no party that's decided to take on privacy because most of the parties haven't really decided to take on anything except furthering themselves. And so like it's not an issue. And again, I think that goes back to like the user education, and the tipping point is once a party realizes that it will be beneficial for them to grasp privacy, then they'll grasp it and it solves all the other problems. But like because there's no like principled stance among either of the parties and it's not like salient to them to like win privacy or be like the privacy party like it is to be the national security party now, like, you know, like you want to be a hawk, right? Like no one wants to be the dove. Like no one wants to be like the privacy guy in Congress, right? Like closest thing we have to that is like Ron Paul and like whatever. I don't know if this answers your question, but all right. Oh boy, here we. Now everything's gonna come crashing down.
No,
Sorry.
no, I hope it'll all come together. So one of the things I was thinking about going back to the idea of the social contract,
Sure.
right? I don't know if that's. I wonder if that's helpful in this context. You know, in thinking about kind of classic pictures of the social contract, and some of the other values that, as you alluded to, you know, citizens will recognize as being protected by that contract. I wonder if privacy is of a different nature, right? So people talk about civil liberties, right?
Mm-hmm.
Civil liberty is different from a natural liberty because it's a liberty that is protected by government. I wonder if there's a problem with privacy in that we have a long tradition, we have weaker philosophic foundations for thinking of privacy as something that government protects, right? The default kind of liberal picture is privacy is the government staying out of this area, right? There's
The freedom to be left alone.
Freedom to be left alone. It's public-private. That's what it does best. But in a funny way, despite the abuses you've chronicled, I think part of your story is you actually need a responsible and proactive set of government forces and agents vigilantly protecting this area as much as they do other cherished values like liberty, security, order, right? I mean, as much as some people say the government does a bad job, it abuses our liberties, the expectation is still that Congress will write laws protecting rights, courts will enforce civil liberties, and those values will get advanced by government agents and agencies. So the question is, or maybe it's just a comment, the question is there something inherent in privacy that makes it harder to protect by the government, and does it sort of defy our expectations about what government's supposed to do?
Mm-hmm. I think sort of like three responses to that, and thanks. I think that's helpful. First is I think that like an element of this that comes into play is kind of like a Rawlsian conception of administrative justice as like fairness. Like justice as fairness is administrative justice, like procedurally doing things the way that we've said that we'll do them. And we need to be able to evaluate whether the government's done that or not. But the government doesn't tell us what they're doing, and so you kind of like lose that conception. And like I think that's a very important part of it, because I really think that the law exists to, my view is of what the law should be, is that it should be a thing that makes up for and enacts goods that would not otherwise be enacted. Like we need roads, they wouldn't happen naturally, so the government needs to solve it. Basically any collective action problem, I think that's where the government should step in. And privacy is not necessarily a collective action problem because it's ultimately like an individual problem. Some people care about the privacy, some people don't, some people know about it, some people don't. And so like I think a second part of this is what you alluded to, is I think we do need involvement from the government. And I think as much as I hesitate to like say this, because I think ultimately, to quote one of the more recent Game of Thrones episodes, like titles beget titles. I think we need like a chief privacy officer for the United States. Because like privacy is like we say, and in work, it's like a cross-functional thing, but like privacy cuts across everything. Yet there's no unified piece of legislation about privacy in the US. There are like, 50 or 100 different alphabet soup-like pieces of legislation that cover privacy in some form or another. You're like the Video like Protection Act or whatever that they just repealed for Netflix. Like that kind of was like a privacy thing, right? And it's like, there's no like central framework or law, and there's no office or person that's appointed to be in charge of privacy, right? Like the FTC is the default privacy advocate, but like they're not like privacy experts, right? The only person who's like really actively involved in it is Julie Brill. And like, I think like she's brilliant and thoughtful and stuff, but like they also have a bazillion other things that they have to regulate. Like the same organization should not be regulating whether like a company buying another company is monopolistic as is regulating privacy. And so like I agree with you because I really do think that like there are two really important administrative fixes here. One is we need a privacy law that says what privacy is and like lays it out and centralizes it and like gives some of the more robust, because it's like Europe has great protective laws. Not great in the sense that like I agree with all of them, but they have them. And then we need like a centralized place where like we can raise these types of grievances and like where this type of question is addressed. Because right now it's kind of like, maybe it's Congress, maybe it's Supreme Court, maybe it's FTC, FCC, like certain other offices, like the chief technologist is like a little interested in this. But I don't know if that answers your question. But I think that's sort of like, I agree on the whole that I think like we need something from the government. But like it won't go up the ladder from there until like there are like enough people who are angry and who are calling their congressmen and are like, how you can get reelected? Privacy. And that's a ways in the future, I think. Other question? Yeah.
I have one. I was thinking in terms of age, like, older people and a lot of people in politics that don't have a real understanding of how technology works, how cell phone, and I take myself as an example. You mentioned before going from a flip up to an iPhone. I just did that 2 weeks ago. So
it's tough.
I'm a classic.
It's a big change, though.
Yeah, I was like, I'm afraid I'm going to do something that I shouldn't do, or I'm going to mess myself up by touching a wrong button.
Don't press the self-destruct. It's just.
Right. Oh, my daughter blocked that out, so I'm okay. But I'm thinking if younger people had this decision to make as far as the privacy, do you think that it would be more likely to happen because they have a better understanding of the things that can happen through internet or through cell phones, which the older generation really doesn't see it as a problem because they don't have that much of a handle on it?
Mm-hmm. I do think like it's always interesting to me to like work. So before I worked at Facebook, I worked for a company that built genealogy products. And it was really interesting there because it was like our user base there was very different than our user base at Facebook. Because it's like a lot of people at Facebook, it's like we're all young and like we all work together. And so it's kind of like, it's very easy for me to talk to an engineer or like, talk about things because we have kind of like a shared vocabulary. But like when I talk to my mother or my grandmother about technology and like my job, they're proud of me. It's like, we don't really talk about what I do. And it's sort of like, I think a big part of that is it's like if you've grown up with certain interfaces, they feel natural to you. It's like easy to like learn how to like touch them and like you just kind of like guess, right? Because it's like your brain just starts to be like, oh, I know there will be X type of button in this kind of application or something like that. And so I think like honestly like a big part of like what I think would be a great solve is it's like you need people who are like young, brilliant engineers to like work in the FTC or to work for a congressman or something like that, who can like go in and like, I know people, we have people at Facebook who like didn't graduate from college, who are like going to always be 10 times as smart as I could ever be about computers, even if I like went and got a degree in computer science. Because it's, and like, they don't need to work for these offices, but it would be awesome to get someone like that to go into like a congressman's office or to go to a committee briefing, so you don't just have a bunch of lawyers sitting around talking about how to regulate computers, like when they don't know them. You know, it's like you just need someone who can go in and explain it, and who can like give the baseline for how technology works. And I think like that's honestly like to me is like an easy short-term fix for part of the information gap. But it just like it doesn't happen because it's like, you know, titles beget titles, and like lawyers want to talk to other lawyers, and I think that's a big problem.
I just wanted to know what first motivated you to like get interested in like the Privacy Act, and have you ever experienced a situation whereas you felt as though your privacy was violated?
Yeah. So what motivated me to get interested in it first is I'm really like part of it was I was working at this Supreme Court blog when one of these Supreme Court decisions came out, and I was like, that doesn't make any sense. And I just sort of started reading it and getting interested in it, and then just realized it was like one of these places where like it's just like a little pocket of society that like goes pretty unexamined, but that has like incredibly explosive implications into our personal lives and like how we develop as people. And just like started reading about it and started becoming curious about it. But I think the big thing was like reading one of these first like Supreme Court decisions and being like, wait, I think everyone expects certain things to be private. Like I really do. Like I think that everyone who sends a text message on their phone, a password protected phone, yeah, like you assume it's private, you know? Second, have I had technology or privacy? Oh yeah, all the time. I mean, we all do. Like, if you, like Verizon and all these other places, like Verizon and your bank, most of the times, if you read deep into their terms, they tell you that they can sell your information to marketers, like your bank. So it's like, they don't even need to go through like a rewards card. Like Verizon will just sell your information about like what text you're sending, who you're texting, where you are, to like different subscribers, and you get ads based on that. Or like, you know, your healthcare providers even can sell your health records to people. So I think like I've gotten, you know, multiple times like gotten ads for something where I'm like, man, really? Like you too? Yeah. So yeah, I think like it happens to all of us. I think it's just like, it's a question of whether you view that as being like, oh, awesome, like that's so convenient that I got an ad for like what I needed now, or whether you view that as being like who told you about that? And I think I'm probably more in the latter category.
So we'd like to thank you for coming out, and we certainly appreciate it. And
cool. Thanks, everyone.